particularly welcome at all. "I'm Sandra Collins, HOA president. That's quite a vehicle you have there. What do you do for a living?" The question came with the subtlety of a tax audit, her eyes already cataloging everything from my work boots to the federal government license plate frame I'd forgotten to remove. "I work from home," I replied, which was technically true. My home office had secure communication equipment that let me coordinate with field teams across 6 states. "Government contractor stuff. Pretty boring." Sandra's smile tightened like a piano wire. "Government disability? Food stamps? We maintain certain standards here in Maplewood. Nothing personal, but a car like that raises questions about income sources." The audacity hit me like a slap, but I kept my voice level. "Just lucky, I guess." She spent the next 10 minutes explaining HOA rules with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list, but her eyes never stopped moving, checking my mailbox, my lawn height, the angle of my garage door. Every glance was a calculation, every pause a measurement against some internal checklist of neighborhood compliance. "The economic disparity clause is particularly important," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Vehicles that create unrealistic expectations or make other residents feel inadequate can be subject to fines. $500 for the first violation." I should have known right then that Sandra wasn't just enforcing rules. She was hunting for weapons to use against anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. But I was tired, still unpacking, and honestly thought this was just typical HOA nonsense that would blow over once she found someone else to bother. The first violation notice appeared in my mailbox exactly 72 hours later. Notice of violation, economic disparity, vehicle. Fine, $500, pay within 10 days or face additional penalties. The absurdity was so complete I actually laughed out loud, standing there in my driveway holding a piece of paper that essentially fined me for owning something nice. I folded the notice once and slid it into my back pocket like evidence I would file later. The afternoon light turned the hood of the Porsche into a mirror, and my face looked calmer than I felt. Calm is a tool. It lets you take inventory instead of taking the bait. I checked the curb line, the sight lines from each window, and the angle of Sandra's porch where a person could film without being seen. You learn a block the way you learn a case. Identify pressure points. Mark exits. Decide what you will not do. I would not give her a scene. I would give her a record. My neighbors were watching through their windows, some curious, others already looking away like they didn't want to get involved. That's when I realized Sandra wasn't just targeting me personally. She was sending a message to the entire neighborhood about what happened when you stood out, when you didn't conform, when you made her feel like her authority might not be absolute. That evening, as I sat in my home office reviewing case files about interstate fugitives and federal jurisdiction, my secure phone rang. "Agent Torres," the voice said, using my operational title rather than my Marshal designation. "Status report on your cover assignment." I glanced out my window toward Sandra's house, where I could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains, probably planning her next move in whatever game she thought we were playing. "Sir, the subject has initiated contact and appears to be escalating harassment tactics. She's treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and anyone who doesn't bow down is seen as a potential threat to her authority." My supervisor's voice carried that familiar tone of someone who'd seen too many small-town tyrants think they were untouchable. Permission to maintain cover and document all interactions. This could develop into something larger than simple neighbor disputes. As I hung up the secure line, I looked directly at Sandra's house through my window, knowing she was probably watching mine just as carefully. I pulled something metallic from my desk drawer, not my service weapon, but the small recording device we used for documenting witness intimidation cases. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent 2 decades catching people who thought that they were above the law, only to move next door to someone who might be building her own little criminal empire, one HOA violation at a time. I clipped the device inside my jacket and whispered to myself, "Time to see how far you're willing to go, Sandra." Sandra's next move proved she wasn't just some petty HOA busybody. She was strategic, methodical, and apparently had connections I hadn't anticipated. 3 days after my violation notice, a patrol car pulled into my driveway, and I knew immediately that Sandra had been working her magic on the local police department. The officer who stepped out looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but his badge was real enough, even if his enthusiasm for whatever Sandra had convinced him to do wasn't. Detective Brooks was pushing 50, carrying about 30 extra pounds around his midsection, and had the demeanor of someone who'd figured out how to do minimum work for maximum paycheck years ago. You know the type. The kind of cop who sees every call as an interruption to his real job of sitting in his patrol car, drinking coffee, and counting down the hours until retirement. Mr. Torres, I'm Detective Brooks with the County Sheriff's Office. Got a call about some concerns regarding your vehicle and residence. Mind if we chat for a few minutes? His tone was professionally neutral, but something in his eyes suggested this wasn't entirely official business, and I could practically smell the coffee and donuts on his breath as he approached my front door. The whole situation had Sandra's fingerprints all over it. She'd somehow convinced this lazy cop that investigating her neighbor's Porsche was a legitimate use of police resources, probably by spinning some story about suspicious activity that sounded official enough to get his attention. What Brooks didn't realize was that he was about to become an unwitting participant in what would eventually become a federal case, and his half-hearted investigation would be documented as evidence of corruption and conspiracy when everything finally came crashing down. "What kind of concerns are we talking about, Detective?" I asked, though I already suspected Sandra had been spinning tales about tax evasion, drug dealing, or whatever story she thought would get local law enforcement interested in harassing her problem neighbor. Brooks pulled out a small notepad, more for show than necessity, and gestured toward my Porsche with the casual interest of someone going through motions he'd rather avoid. "Well, there have been some questions about the vehicle registration, potential tax issues, and maybe some neighbors worried about unusual activity in the neighborhood. You work from home, right? What kind of work exactly?" Each word sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced this conversation in his car before walking up my driveway, and I caught him glancing toward Sandra's house, where I was certain she was watching through her blinds, with the satisfaction of someone whose plan was unfolding exactly as she'd hoped. I could have ended this conversation immediately by showing Brooks my federal credentials, but something told me to let Sandra's plan play out a little longer and see just how far she was willing to escalate her suburban power trip before it inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own illegality. "Government contractor work, Detective. Background checks, database searches, financial investigations, pretty standard federal support stuff. Nothing exciting, just a lot of computer work and phone calls with various agencies." Brooks nodded like that explained everything, but his follow-up questions revealed exactly what Sandra had been feeding him: concerns about unreported income, suspicious visitors, and potential criminal activity hidden behind the facade of legitimate government work. The woman was essentially trying to get local law enforcement to investigate a federal agent based on her paranoid theories about anyone who owns something nice while working from home. The conversation dragged on for another 15 minutes, with Brooks asking increasingly pointed questions that clearly came from Sandra's script rather than any legitimate police investigation. He wanted to know about my work schedule, my income sources, whether I'd had any unusual visitors lately, and why someone doing computer work needed such an expensive car. Questions that revealed both Sandra's suburban paranoia and Brooks's complete lack of understanding about federal law enforcement operations. When he finally left, I watched him drive directly to Sandra's house, where he sat in her driveway for another 20 minutes, having what looked like a debriefing session about his investigation into the suspicious neighbor with the fancy car and the vague job description. That night, I discovered my tires had been slashed. Not random vandalism, but precision cuts that required complete replacement and sent a clear message that Sandra's harassment campaign had escalated from paperwork to actual property damage. The tire slashing was just the opening salvo in what became Sandra's systematic campaign to make my life miserable, and within a week, she'd transformed from annoying HOA president into full-time neighborhood terrorist with an apparently unlimited capacity for creative harassment. She filed noise complaints about my garage door opening before 7 a.m., photographed my garbage cans being set out too early, according to some obscure city ordinance she'd discovered, and somehow convinced the Postal Service to investigate whether I was receiving excessive packages that might indicate illegal activity. Each complaint was professionally formatted, legally phrased, and designed to create a paper trail that made me look like a problem resident who needed constant monitoring, and the woman's attention to detail suggested she'd been planning this campaign long before I'd given her any actual reason to target me. What hurt more than the harassment itself was watching my neighbors slowly distance themselves from the situation, like Sandra's paranoia was some kind of contagious disease they might catch by association. Mrs. Patterson, who'd brought me cookies when I moved in, now avoided eye contact when I waved from my driveway. The young couple with the golden retriever crossed the street rather than walk past my house during their evening walks, probably convinced by Sandra's whisper campaign that I was some kind of threat to neighborhood safety. Even the kids who'd initially been fascinated by my Porsche now steered clear, their parents having obviously warned them away from the suspicious neighbor who worked from home and owned things that made other people uncomfortable. Sandra was methodically isolating me, using social pressure and implied threats to turn the community against someone they barely knew but were afraid to defend. Then Elena called to arrange her first visit to my new place, and I knew immediately that Sandra's poison had spread beyond Maplewood when my own daughter started the conversation with questions about neighborhood problems she'd somehow heard about before even seeing my house. "Dad, I've been hearing things about where you live. Something about HOA issues and complaints about suspicious activity. My friends are asking if you're having legal problems, and honestly, it's starting to affect my professional reputation." The words hit like physical blows because Elena had worked incredibly hard to build her career in corporate law, and the idea that her father's problems might somehow tarnish her professional image was clearly keeping her awake at night with worry about guilt by association. "It's just HOA drama, sweetheart. Some busybody with too much time on her hands who doesn't like my car. It'll blow over once she finds someone else to bother." But even as I said the words, I knew Elena wasn't buying my explanation, especially when she pulled into my driveway and immediately spotted Sandra taking photographs from across the street like some kind of suburban private investigator building a case against a dangerous criminal. "Dad, that woman is literally photographing my car right now. And Mrs. Henderson at the coffee shop knew who I was before I even mentioned your name. She said there's been complaints about questionable activities and that the HOA is dealing with the situation." What kind of situation requires dealing with? The conversation went downhill from there, with Elena expressing the kind of embarrassment that children feel when their parents become neighborhood scandals, regardless of whether they've actually done anything wrong. "Why don't you just follow their rules? Sell the car? Keep your head down, fit in like everyone else? You're 62 years old, Dad. Isn't it time to stop making waves and just live quietly like a normal retiree?" Her words carried the particular sting that comes from family members who assume you must have done something to deserve whatever treatment you're receiving, and I watched my daughter, the person I'd spent 20 years protecting from the worst parts of my job, look at me like I was the problem she needed protection from, rather than the federal law enforcement officer who dedicated his career to protecting people exactly like her. That evening, after Elena left early with polite excuses, I sat at my desk and forced my eyes across case files that wouldn't stay still. An alert blinked on my secure terminal, then another, then a cascade as the comms dashboard flashed red across multiple nodes. The message was half-written when it froze on screen. "Family unit compromised. Subject escalating, local leakage suspected. The system locked, timed out, and refused every credential I had." The room felt louder in the quiet that followed, and for the first time in months, I recognized the shape of isolation. No network, no cover support, only a neighborhood that had chosen its story about me and a daughter who'd started to believe it. The HOA meeting that sealed my fate was held on a Thursday evening in the community center, and Sandra orchestrated it like a prosecutor presenting her case to a jury she'd already bought and paid for. I walked into a room where 37 of my neighbors sat in folding chairs, most of them avoiding direct eye contact, all of them clearly uncomfortable with whatever Sandra had planned, but too intimidated to object. She'd positioned herself behind a folding table like it was a judge's bench, with printed documents, photographs, and what looked like an official presentation, ready to destroy whatever reputation I had left in Maplewood. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across faces I'd hoped might become friends, but now just looked like strangers waiting to watch an execution. "Thank you all for coming," Sandra began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been planning this moment for months. "We have a serious situation that requires community action. As you know, we've had ongoing issues with a resident who refuses to comply with basic community standards, shows a pattern of suspicious behavior, and has created an atmosphere of uncertainty that affects all of our property values." She gestured toward an easel where she'd mounted enlarged photographs of my house, my car, my garage door, even my mailbox, like evidence in a criminal trial where the crime was existing in her neighborhood. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so effectively destroying my life in front of people who might have been friends under different circumstances. The presentation continued for 23 minutes, with Sandra detailing every interaction we'd had, every complaint she'd filed, every piece of evidence she'd collected to prove that I was somehow a threat to community safety and property values. She referenced my suspicious work schedule, my uncooperative attitude toward legitimate HOA concerns, and my pattern of behavior that suggests possible illegal activity. The accusations were carefully crafted to sound official, without being specific enough to be proven false, and I watched my neighbors' faces change from uncertainty to suspicion to active hostility, as Sandra painted me as some kind of suburban criminal mastermind hiding in plain sight. I wrote down her verbs: suggests, indicates, appears, soft words that harden when no one challenges them. I asked for a copy of the packet, and she said the records would be available after the vote. Process should not chase outcome. The process should lead it. No one in the room wanted that sentence spoken out loud, so I kept it on paper. When she finally called for a vote on whether to support additional measures to address the ongoing situation, the result was 29 in favor, 4 abstentions, and 4 opposed. Mrs. Patterson looked physically ill as she raised her hand to support Sandra's motion, but fear won over conscience when it came time to choose sides. The young couple with the golden retriever stared at their hands during the vote, clearly wanting no part of the decision, but too afraid of becoming Sandra's next targets to oppose her openly. Even Rodriguez, the retired veteran who'd initially seemed friendly, stayed neutral when his voice might have mattered most. The isolation was complete, official, and documented in meeting minutes that would become part of the permanent HOA record. What Sandra had planned next went far beyond typical HOA harassment and entered territory that should have terrified anyone with a basic understanding of federal law. 2 days after the community meeting, I watched through my home security system as she met with 3 men in the parking lot of a costume rental shop 15 miles outside of Maplewood. The conversation lasted 47 minutes, with Sandra showing them photographs, pointing at what appeared to be official documents, and handing over an envelope that was almost certainly full of cash. The men weren't your typical suburban contractors. They moved with the confidence of people who'd done questionable work before and weren't particularly concerned about the legal implications of whatever Sandra was purchasing. The plan, as I later learned through my own investigative channels, was breathtakingly illegal and absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Sandra had hired a specialty services company that provided official-looking personnel for various purposes, essentially professional actors who specialized in impersonating authority figures for corporate training, private investigations, and apparently personal vendettas against neighbors who owned cars that threatened HOA aesthetic standards. She had commissioned police uniforms, official-looking badges, forged paperwork that resembled federal seizure warrants, and even arranged for a tow truck with police-style markings to make the whole operation look completely legitimate to anyone watching from their windows. The 3 men Sandra hired weren't random criminals. They were professionals who'd built a business around the gray areas of impersonation law, walking the line between theatrical services and actual fraud with the skill of people who'd studied exactly how far they could push legal boundaries without triggering serious federal attention. What they hadn't counted on was that their client was essentially hiring them to assault a federal law enforcement officer in front of witnesses, which would transform their specialty services business into a federal conspiracy charge that carried 5 to 10 years in prison. Sandra had managed to upgrade what should have been a simple scam into a case that would involve multiple federal agencies, RICO violations, and conspiracy charges that would destroy everyone involved. During these preparations, I was conducting my own tactical preparation that Sandra mistook for defeat and surrender. She watched me through her blinds as I spent hours in my garage, assuming I was hiding from the community pressure or perhaps preparing to flee before her final solution could be implemented. What she couldn't see was that I was actually setting up sophisticated recording equipment, coordinating with federal backup teams, and documenting every aspect of her escalating criminal conspiracy for what would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of authority impersonation and federal officer intimidation in recent bureau history. The irony was perfect. While Sandra thought she was finally cornering her victim, she was actually building the case that would send her to federal prison. The night before her plan was set to launch, Sandra's SUV idled without lights at the corner, engine ticking as it cooled. She watched the three uniforms drift past my address, not from a bedroom window, but from behind her windshield, a pen tapping the rim of a paper cup. I stood in darkness on the far side of my living room, vest snug, counting their timing and routes against the quiet sweep of the block. 20 years of muscle memory did the rest. I let her think this was reconnaissance. It was documentation. Have you ever had a neighbor who made your life hell? Drop a comment with your worst HOA story. I bet mine still tops yours after what happens next. Night settled over Maplewood like a lid, and I let the house cool to a working silence. In the garage, I laid 2 strips of painter tape along the concrete and marked them with a pencil so any shift in tire position would show on camera. I ran a fingertip across the license plate screws and felt a fresh burr where someone had tried a wrong-size driver. Good to know and better to photograph. On my desk, I opened a blank form and wrote a short script for my own voice. Ask for names. Ask for the issuing agency. Ask for the supervisor on duty and the call sign. Do not argue the law on the porch. Ask for a number to call back. Simple questions weigh more than speeches when the recorder plays. I checked the city website for scheduled utility work and found none on our block. If a truck appeared in the morning, it would not be there to fix the lights. I printed the page for the file. Then I stood in the dark living room and counted the seconds it took a car to roll from the bend to my drive. 7 on a slow night. Fewer when a driver wants momentum. The next morning arrived with the kind of suburban quiet that makes dramatic events feel surreal. Birds chirping, sprinklers running, the distant sound of lawnmowers starting their weekly battle against nature's refusal to stay perfectly manicured. I checked the street once without opening the door. Reflections tell more truth than glass. The hood of a parked sedan gave me the north side. A frame photo by the entry gave me the south in the corner of its glass. Nothing moved, except water arcing from a sprinkler across a patch of lawn that would soon be trampled by attention. It is better to confirm calm than to assume it. At exactly 2 p.m., just as Sandra had announced to the neighborhood, 3 men in crisp police uniforms pulled up to my house in what looked like an official unmarked police vehicle, complete with government plates and the kind of subtle authority that makes normal people automatically comply with whatever demands might follow. The precision of their timing, the professional quality of their uniforms, and the confident way they approached my front door would have convinced anyone watching that this was legitimate law enforcement conducting official business on a residential street where the biggest crime was usually someone forgetting to bring in their garbage cans. Sandra held her station at the front window, as if it were a box seat. Across the block, fabric shifted at the edges of blinds. It felt staged, roles memorized. Only one cue was missing from their script: the unmarked cars with cameras already rolling. The lead fake cop was maybe 35, built like someone who'd done legitimate security work before sliding into less legal employment, and he carried himself with just enough authentic authority to fool anyone who wasn't trained to spot the subtle differences between real and manufactured law enforcement presence. His backup looked nervous, constantly checking his equipment and glancing around like he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever they had been hired to do. But the money Sandra had offered was apparently worth whatever legal risks he thought he might be taking. The third man stayed by their vehicle, clipboard in hand, playing the role of administrative support while actually serving as lookout and driver for their planned escape once they'd completed Sandra's vision of suburban justice. They approached my door with the measured pace of people who'd rehearsed this scenario, probably in Sandra's living room, while she explained exactly how she wanted the confrontation to unfold. The lead fake cop had actual handcuffs hanging from his belt, a radio that crackled with what sounded like official police communications, and a badge that would pass casual inspection from anyone who wasn't trained to spot the telltale signs of quality forgery. His uniform read as convincing at a glance. Patches aligned, insignia where they should be, tactical boots broken in just enough. But the tells were there if you knew where to look. The radio traffic sounded canned, the badge numbering didn't match local convention, and their body language lacked the hard edges of people who've learned to treat every doorstep as potentially dangerous. As they reached my front door, I was watching through my security system while simultaneously coordinating with my real backup through a throat microphone that Sandra's surveillance couldn't detect. A subject approaching target location, 3 individuals in law enforcement costumes, 1 vehicle with fraudulent government plates, multiple witnesses present, federal response team standing by. The response came through my earpiece with the calm professionalism of agents who had spent their careers dealing with people who thought that they could outsmart federal law enforcement. Copy that, Torres. Let them make their play. We'll have everything documented for prosecution. The first words came before the door finished opening. Officer Johnson, Federal Tax Enforcement Division. Warrant to seize your Porsche in connection with tax evasion. He asked for the keys and space to impound. The cadence was polished. The content wasn't. Wrong division, wrong process, wrong law. I let my voice shake slightly, playing the role of a confused citizen who didn't understand what was happening to him. Officers, I think there's been some mistake. I pay my taxes, and I've never had any problems with the government. Can I see some identification? Maybe call your supervisor to clear this up. The request was perfectly reasonable, and exactly what any innocent person would ask. But it also put the fake cops in the position of having to produce documentation they probably hoped wouldn't be closely examined. Officer Johnson held up his badge with the confidence of someone who'd never had it questioned, while his nervous backup pulled out what looked like an official warrant, complete with federal seals, judicial signatures, and enough legal language to impress anyone who didn't know that real federal seizure warrants don't work anything like the document he was showing me. Sir, this is a time-sensitive federal operation, Johnson continued, his voice gaining authority as he warmed to his performance. We have probable cause to believe this vehicle was purchased with unreported income, and federal law requires immediate seizure pending investigation. You can cooperate now and avoid additional charges, or we can arrest you for obstruction and take the vehicle anyway. What's it going to be? The threat was delivered with just enough menace to intimidate most people into compliance, and I could see Sandra practically vibrating with excitement as she watched from her window, probably imagining how satisfying it would be to finally see the neighborhood troublemaker get his comeuppance from legitimate federal authority figures. The backup fake cop was getting more nervous as the conversation continued, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the street like he was worried about something his partners hadn't told him to expect. Look, man, just give us the keys and this'll all be over quickly. No need to make this harder than it has to be, he said, abandoning the professional tone and revealing the kind of street-level intimidation tactics that suggested his law enforcement experience might have come from the wrong side of the badge. His nervousness was actually helping their cause. Real cops dealing with financial crimes would be exactly this anxious about public confrontations that could turn violent. So, his obvious discomfort added authenticity to what was otherwise becoming an increasingly absurd performance. I glanced around the neighborhood, noting which windows had people watching, which houses seemed empty, and where my real backup was positioned for the arrest that was about to happen. Please, officers, I really think there's been some mistake. I'm just a government contractor trying to live quietly in this neighborhood. I don't want any trouble with federal authorities. My voice carried exactly the right note of confused fear that would make Sandra feel triumphant, while also ensuring that every neighbor watching would remember that I'd tried to cooperate before everything went sideways. The fake cops exchanged glances that suggested they thought that this was going exactly as planned, with the added bonus of having a compliant victim who wouldn't cause scenes or complications that might draw unwanted attention to their operation. Officer Johnson stepped closer, close enough that I could see the imperfections in his badge and smell the coffee on his breath, completely unaware that everything he said was being recorded by multiple federal agencies and would be used to ensure he spent the next 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Time's up, buddy. We're taking that car one way or another. You can either hand over the keys like a good citizen, or we can arrest you right here in front of all your neighbors and take them anyway. What's it going to be? The ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards, while I prepared to show him exactly what happened when petty criminals tried to intimidate federal law enforcement officers who'd spent their careers dealing with people far more dangerous than Sandra's hired help. The moment when everything shifted felt like the air pressure changing before a thunderstorm. You could sense something fundamental was about to happen, even if the fake cops were too focused on their performance to notice the change in atmosphere. Officer Johnson reached for my arm with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent the last 10 minutes assuming I was just another suburban victim who would fold under pressure. But the second his fingers made contact with my jacket, 20 years of federal training kicked in with the precision of muscle memory that had kept me alive through 2 decades of arresting people who absolutely did not want to be arrested. I caught his wrist in a grip that immediately communicated to anyone with real law enforcement experience that they'd just made a serious tactical error. You sure you want to do that, Officer Johnson? The question came out in a voice that no longer shook with fear, no longer carried the confusion of a law-abiding citizen being harassed by government authority. Instead, it carried the calm, measured tone of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with people who thought they could intimidate federal agents. And Johnson's eyes widened as he realized that something had gone very wrong with what was supposed to be a simple intimidation job. His backup stepped forward, probably thinking they could use physical numbers to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond there to manage. But he stopped dead when he saw my expression change from confused victim to something that looked distinctly predatory. "What's your badge number, Officer Johnson?" I asked, keeping his wrist where it was. "And this paperwork?" Wrong case format, wrong signatures, wrong playbook. I didn't need to lecture. The realization hit him faster than any explanation could, and I watched confusion curdle into the kind of panic that says a man finally understands what he stepped into. The nervous backup cop was now actively sweating, which had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature, and everything to do with the growing realization that whatever Sandra had hired them to do was turning into something far more serious than they'd been prepared for. "Look, man, we're just doing a job here. Nobody wants any trouble, right? Maybe we can work something out." The words tumbled out with the desperation of someone who could see his carefully planned criminal enterprise collapsing in real time. But his attempt at negotiation only confirmed what I already knew. These weren't professional law enforcement officers following legitimate procedures. They were hired actors who'd gotten in over their heads and were about to discover the difference between impersonating cops for corporate training videos and actually attempting to intimidate federal law enforcement. Sandra was still watching from her window, but her expression had changed from triumphant anticipation to something that looked distinctly worried, like someone who'd just realized that her perfect plan might not be unfolding exactly as she'd scripted it. The street went quiet in that strange, heavy way that precedes a storm. Curtains stilled. A latch clicked. On Rodriguez's porch, a shadow straightened, measuring the distance and the stakes. No one needed phones now. Everyone understood this was no longer a neighborhood spectacle. I released Johnson's wrist and stepped back, giving myself tactical distance while reaching into my jacket with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted everyone watching to see exactly what was about to happen. Breath slowed, vision narrowed to useful edges, the radio static from down the block thinned to a thread. I counted the beat it takes a man to decide whether to run. He did not run. He waited for permission that would not come. The street waited with him. "Gentlemen, before this goes any further, I think there's something you should know about the person you've been hired to intimidate." The fake cops were now clearly realizing that their simple intimidation job had become something far more complex and dangerous. But they were committed to a course of action that was about to destroy their lives in ways they couldn't possibly have anticipated when Sandra first approached them with her suburban revenge fantasy. What happened next reset the room. I took out my credentials and held them where every set of eyes could meet them. Deputy U.S. Marshal Marcus Torres, badge number 47291, 20 years, thousands of arrests. The authority here wasn't a costume, it was jurisdiction. Deputy U.S. Marshal Marcus Torres, badge number 47291, I said, holding my credentials where everyone could see them, while simultaneously watching the blood drain from 3 faces, as professional criminals realized they just attempted to intimidate a federal law enforcement officer in front of multiple witnesses. "You gentlemen are under arrest for impersonating federal officers, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted intimidation of a federal law enforcement agent. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right immediately." The words came out with the calm authority of someone who'd delivered this speech thousands of times, but never under circumstances quite this personally satisfying. Johnson's fake confidence evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing your relatively minor criminal enterprise has just become a federal case with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. "Wait, what? You can't be. You're just some unemployed guy with a fancy car. The lady said you were nobody, just some deadbeat trying to look important." His voice cracked with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed worldview was collapsing in real time. And I almost felt sorry for him, until I remembered that he'd been perfectly willing to intimidate and potentially assault what he thought was an innocent civilian for Sandra's suburban power trip. "The lady was wrong about a lot of things," I replied, pulling out my handcuffs. The real ones that had restrained everyone from white-collar embezzlers to violent fugitives during my 2 decades of federal service. Starting with thinking she could hire criminals to solve her HOA problems without facing federal consequences. The backup cop made a movement that looked like he might be considering running, but stopped when he realized that federal marshals don't work alone, and running from this situation would only add fleeing and eluding charges to what was already going to be a very long federal indictment. The professional takedown that followed was textbook federal law enforcement, controlled, efficient, and absolutely by the book, because the last thing I wanted was some defense attorney claiming excessive force when these cases went to trial. Johnson went down with the kind of compliance that comes from finally understanding that resistance would only make everything worse, while his backup actually seemed relieved that the charade was finally over and he could stop pretending to be something he was never trained to be. The third fake cop by the vehicle looked like he was considering making a break for it until he saw real federal agents emerging from unmarked cars throughout the neighborhood, all of them wearing the kind of tactical gears that makes it very clear that running is not a viable option. Within 3 minutes, 3 professional criminals who'd thought that they were participating in an elaborate prank were face down on my driveway in zip-tie restraints, while real federal agents secured the scene and began the process of documenting what would become one of the most thoroughly prosecuted cases of law enforcement impersonation in recent memory. The look on Sandra's face as she watched from her window was absolutely priceless. The expression of someone who'd just realized that her perfect plan to destroy her neighbor had instead destroyed her own life in ways she couldn't possibly have anticipated when she first decided that a federal law enforcement officer was just another suburban victim she could intimidate into compliance. As Marcus handcuffs the fake cops, Sandra comes running out screaming, "What are you doing? They're police officers." Marcus turns to her with his badge visible. "No, Sandra, they're criminals, just like you're about to be." The transformation of my quiet suburban street into a federal crime scene happened with the kind of precision that comes from months of planning and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Within minutes of my arrest by the fake cops, unmarked vehicles that had been positioned throughout Maplewood began converging on the location, disgorging real federal agents wearing tactical gear that made it very clear to everyone watching that this was not some neighborhood dispute that had gotten out of hand. These were serious federal law enforcement officers conducting a serious federal operation that had been building for months, while Sandra thought she was just harassing some unemployed loser with a fancy car. Agent Laura Mitchell emerged from the lead vehicle with the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent 15 years building federal cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught by government investigators. She approached Sandra, who was still standing in her driveway with the expression of someone trying to process how her perfect revenge plan had suddenly turned into the worst day of her life, and produced the kind of official credentials that make it very clear when someone's suburban power trip has escalated into federal criminal territory. "Sandra Collins, I'm Special Agent Mitchell with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to assault a federal law enforcement agent." Sandra's reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone whose carefully constructed world of suburban authority had just been revealed as a criminal conspiracy that would send her to federal prison for the next 5 to 10 years. "This is impossible. I don't know what you're talking about. Those were real police officers conducting legitimate business." The denial came out in a voice that was climbing toward hysteria, but Agent Mitchell had probably heard similar protests from hundreds of federal defendants who thought their crimes would never catch up with them. "Ma'am, we have recordings of your conversations with the individuals you hired, bank records showing the payments you made, and testimony from multiple witnesses regarding your systematic harassment of a federal law enforcement officer." The handcuffs clicking onto Sandra's wrists produced the kind of metallic sound that echoes in suburban neighborhoods where the biggest excitement is usually someone's garbage cans blowing over in a windstorm. But this sound represented the end of months of intimidation, harassment, and escalating criminal behavior that had started with petty HOA violations and ended with federal conspiracy charges, carrying mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure Sandra had plenty of time to think about her choices while serving her debt to society in federal custody. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Mitchell continued, "and given the federal charges you're facing, I'd strongly recommend exercising that right until you can speak with an attorney who understands federal criminal law." The neighbors who had spent months watching Sandra's campaign against me were now watching her be arrested by real federal agents, and the expressions on their faces ranged from shock to guilt to the kind of relief that comes from finally seeing a neighborhood bully face real consequences for their actions. Mrs. Patterson was crying, whether from guilt over her complicity or relief that Sandra's reign of terror was finally over, I couldn't tell. Rodriguez stepped forward like he wanted to say something, probably an apology for not standing up when his voice might have mattered. But the presence of federal agents conducting arrests made casual conversation seem inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. The ripple effect of watching their HOA president get arrested by federal agents hit the Maplewood community like a psychological earthquake that forced everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the past 6 months of neighborhood drama. These were people who'd convinced themselves that going along with Sandra's harassment was easier than getting involved, that staying neutral in the face of obvious bullying was somehow the moral high ground, that a federal law enforcement officer was just some suspicious character who deserved whatever treatment the HOA president decided to dish out. Now they were watching that same HOA president get loaded into the back of a federal vehicle while agents secured evidence that would be used to prosecute her for crimes they didn't even know were possible in suburban neighborhoods. Oh my God. We almost became accomplices to assaulting a federal agent, Mrs. Patterson whispered, and her words carried the weight of a community that had spent months being manipulated into participating in what was essentially a criminal conspiracy. The realization was spreading through the crowd of neighbors like a virus. They hadn't just been innocent bystanders watching neighbor drama unfold. They'd been unwitting participants in witness intimidation, harassment of a federal officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Every vote they'd cast supporting Sandra's additional measures, every time they'd shunned me at her encouragement, every moment they'd chosen her version of events over basic human decency had potentially made them accessories to federal crimes. Rodriguez approached me with the demeanor of someone who'd spent sleepless nights knowing he should have spoken up, but hadn't found the courage until it was too late to matter. Marshal Torres, I want to apologize. I knew something wasn't right about how Sandra was treating you, but I was afraid of becoming her next target if I spoke up. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, but I was too scared of some HOA president to do the right thing when it counted. His words carried the shame of someone whose military service had taught him about courage and honor, but whose civilian life had let fear override those principles when they were needed most. The young couple with the golden retriever were holding each other like they'd just survived a natural disaster, probably realizing that their decision to avoid me rather than risk Sandra's wrath had made them witnesses to federal crimes rather than the neutral parties they'd thought they were. We had no idea she was planning anything illegal, the wife said, though her words sounded like someone trying to convince herself as much as anyone listening. She just said there were concerns about suspicious behavior and that the community needed to stick together. We thought we were just being good neighbors by supporting the HOA president's legitimate concerns about neighborhood safety. Elena's arrival in the middle of this federal law enforcement operation was like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. My daughter pulling into a driveway where fake cops were being loaded into federal vehicles, while real agents processed evidence from the most thoroughly documented case of neighbor harassment in recent memory. She got out of her car with the expression of someone trying to process a scene that looked like it belonged in a federal crime drama, rather than the quiet suburban neighborhood where her father had moved for peace and quiet. Dad, how are those real FBI agents? Did someone just get arrested in your driveway? The questions tumbled out with the confusion of someone whose understanding of her father's life was being completely rewritten in real time. Elena, sweetheart, remember when I told you I work for the government? I said, putting my arm around my daughter, who had spent months being ashamed of what she thought was her father's weakness. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal. I have been for 20 years. Sandra didn't just harass some unemployed loser. She systematically intimidated a federal law enforcement officer, hired criminals to impersonate government agents, and essentially built a federal case against herself while thinking she was just dealing with a neighborhood troublemaker who owned a car that threatened her sense of suburban order. Sandra's perp walk past the neighbors, who had spent months enabling her harassment campaign, was the kind of moment that burns itself into community memory. The image of someone who'd wielded HOA authority like a weapon being led away in federal handcuffs, while real law enforcement officers treated her like exactly what she'd become. A federal criminal whose suburban power trip had escalated into crimes that would define her legacy for the rest of her life. The woman who'd spent months photographing my garbage cans and measuring my grass height was now having her own rights read to her by agents who'd built careers prosecuting people who thought they were above the law. and every neighbor who'd watched her systematic campaign against me was now watching her face the consequences of thinking federal law enforcement officers were just another target for HOA intimidation. The media attention that followed was swift and brutal, turning Sandra's arrest into exactly the kind of local news story that destroys reputations and becomes a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks neighborhood politics can escalate into federal crimes without serious consequences. Local HOA president arrested in federal conspiracy case ran as the lead story on 3 different news stations, complete with footage of Sandra being loaded into federal vehicles while reporters explained how a dispute over parking violations had escalated into charges carrying 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had tried to destroy my reputation for owning an expensive car was now having her own mugshot broadcast across the region, as an example of how suburban authority can turn criminal when wielded by people with no understanding of actual legal boundaries. Mrs. Patterson approached me with homemade cookies and an apology that carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights knowing she'd failed a basic test of human decency. Marshal Torres, I brought these when you first moved in, and I should have kept bringing them every week instead of letting Sandra convince me you were some kind of threat to our community. I was scared of her, but that's no excuse for abandoning a neighbor who never did anything wrong except own something nice and work from home. Her words represented what I hoped was the beginning of a community reckoning with how they'd allowed fear of one person's manufactured authority to override their basic obligation to treat neighbors with dignity and respect. The young couple with the golden retriever brought their dog over for the introduction that should have happened months ago if Sandra hadn't convinced everyone that associating with me was somehow dangerous to their standing in the neighborhood. "We're Jake and Emma Richardson," the husband said, extending his hand with the sheepish expression of someone who knew they'd missed obvious signs of federal law enforcement presence because they'd been too focused on avoiding HOA drama. "Our dog is Charlie, and he's been wanting to meet you since you moved in, but we were too worried about Sandra's reaction to let him wander over here. Turns out we were worried about the wrong person's reaction to neighborly behavior." Rodriguez organized an impromptu neighborhood gathering that evening, partly to process what had happened, and partly to begin the work of rebuilding community relationships that had been poisoned by months of Sandra's divisive leadership. "I think we all learned something about what happens when we let fear override our obligation to stand up for what's right," he said, addressing the group of neighbors who'd gathered in his backyard to discuss how they'd move forward as a community that had nearly become accessories to federal crimes. Marshal Torres served his country for 20 years, moved here for peace and quiet, and instead of welcoming a federal law enforcement officer to our neighborhood, we let him. Sandra's federal sentencing 3 months later was attended by several Maplewood residents who wanted to see the conclusion of the case that had transformed their understanding of neighborhood politics and federal law enforcement. Judge Patricia Williams delivered a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of Sandra's crimes and the broader implications of civilian attempts to intimidate federal law enforcement officers. 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, full restitution for property damage and legal costs, and a lifetime ban from serving in any homeowners association leadership position. "Ms. Collins, your actions represent a fundamental misunderstanding of both federal law and the responsibilities that come with community leadership," Judge Williams said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many cases where small-time authority had escalated into serious federal crimes. The transformation of Maplewood under Rodriguez's leadership as the new HOA president was like watching a community recover from an abusive relationship. Tentative at first, then increasingly confident as people remembered what normal neighborhood interactions looked like when they weren't filtered through fear of arbitrary punishment for imaginary violations. The first item of business was repealing Sandra's economic